Good evening and welcome to the Frontline Club. My name's Julie Tomlin, I'm Programme Editor here, and it's great to see so many of you turn out at such short notice. Obviously there's a lot of interest in the subject. So just a couple of things. If you've got a phone, could you turn it off or to silent?
Thank you.
And later on when there's comments, questions, if you could speak into the microphone, which will come round. And if you could do that for the sake of the people listening online as well, because we are being broadcast live and it helps them to be able to hear what you're saying. And I think that's about it. So I'm going to hand over to Paddy O'Connell. Thank you.
Hello everyone, it's lovely to see everyone here again. We normally run these once a month, and then we've inserted this as an emergency meeting. So it's great to see you. And the house rules are we promise to begin on time. I think you'll find it's 7 now. And we will end on time because we know you're very busy people. We're running it as a public meeting, so we do very much hope for your questions. But crucially, if you've come into the room for a briefing and you're not getting it, please do say early, and we can beat the panel up and make sure that they give you what you want. These are amazing times to be living in, and that's why you're here, it's why we're here. Welcome, it's great to see you. If you're twittering or tweeting, it's #Frontline Club. What I suggest is that the panel introduce themselves with a brief biography and give us the thing they want to tell us or the thing they want to know. And then I'm pleased to say we'll cross to Egypt by Skype, and you're very welcome to add questions in when we get there. But let's just go down the room. Welcome everybody, and welcome Lindsay Hilson.
Okay.
Will you tell us who you are and what you think?
I'm Lindsay Hilson. I'm the international editor of Channel 4 News. I came back from Egypt on Sunday night. I had been there just over 2 weeks. I went first of all to Alexandria, where I reported for several days, and then back to Cairo. And so I missed the really nasty bit in Cairo, where some of my colleagues got beaten up, including my friend Peter here. But I was there for the great and thrilling moment when Mubarak finally stepped down. The thing which I find most intriguing about this revolution is the fact that it's a genuine revolution. I believe that. And yet, at the same time, it's the army handing power to itself. And this is a very confusing and strange situation, which I have not seen before. And so I think that the enthusiasm and excitement which I experienced in the crowd was absolutely genuine and not misplaced. And yet, we still don't know how this thing is going to work out.
Maha Azan, I'm an associate fellow at Chatham House, and I'm an Egyptian, and I was in Tahrir Square just before Lindsay. I came back about a week ago, so I missed Mubarak stepping down, but I was there during the nasty bit. I'll say that I wasn't actually there in Tahrir Square at that time, but it was an amazing time to be in Egypt, a momentous period for the Egyptian people, and I witnessed at first hand what people have spoken of as the breaking of the barrier of fear. I could hear and see Egyptian men and women speaking out against their president, speaking out against corruption, calling for an end to an authoritarian regime, using every possible slogan, calling for Mr. Mubarak's trial and for the trial of others. And that was an amazing step forward, I think, from a country where people were afraid to speak. There had been a degree of opening up in the media over several years, but nothing like this, where ordinary Egyptians were no longer afraid to speak out. And I think that in itself is a revolution. In terms of the political structures, in terms of where Egypt is going, in terms of where the military is now, no, we're still far from a revolution. That is yet to come. The obstacles are great. I think we have the whole issue of the state security structure to be dealt with and dismantled. We have the military to deal with, and for the military to go back to the barracks, which is a tall order.
Thank you, Maha. And Dr. Azam is Associate Fellow at Chatham House. To you, Omar, would you kindly do the same job?
Yes, I'm Omar Ashur. I'm a lecturer in the politics of the Middle East in the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies in the University of Exeter. I am Egyptian as well, and I am a pro-democracy activist who was very close to many of the brave youth who took the streets and camped in Tahrir Square. Many of them are former colleagues from the American University in Cairo, where I graduated. Some are former either mentors or friends or just people from my generation and younger. And obviously it's an overwhelming times for a person who come from this background. What I'm interested in looking at is how this transition period will end. And I guess that's the critical question at this point, given the stance of the military now, given the dynamics that Egypt is going through, whether on the civil society dynamics or whether on the military dynamics or whether from the current government that was appointed by Mr. Mubarak. And one extra bit, whether we are seeing the fourth wave of democratization now hitting the shores of the Middle East and North Africa, or are we going to see something that is limited only to Tunisia and Egypt?
Thank you very much. How old are you, can I ask?
I'm 35.
35. Just checking there. You look like the youngest on the panel. That's it's very annoying. And Peter, to you.
I'm Peter Beaumont. I was on assignment in Tunisia and Egypt for The Guardian and The Observer. I mean, I had an interesting outlook in that I missed the nasty bit in Tunisia but arrived in Cairo for the nasty bit there, like Maha. What interests me, having seen a good part of 2 revolutions in 2 months, is how an extremely passionate but broad and diffuse collection of networks have come together in a protest movement and negotiate with the entrenched interests in states like Tunisia and Egypt. And I mean, as Maha said, I mean, this is a revolution that's not finished. I mean, Mubarak's been removed. I mean, he's the figure at the top. But how do you then carry on and negotiate with all the generals who are businessmen and all the politicians who have interests in the state? And how can this very incomplete sort of process of democratization be pushed forward? Because at the moment, I think you've seen a decapitation of kind of representative figures, but that has not necessarily been followed through into what one would call a complete revolution.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's divide the evening up. What now for Egypt, part 1, and its neighbours, part 2. Anyway, let's cross to Adaf Souif in Cairo by Skype. I suggest panellists, please guide questions to her, and also here in the room, it's your opportunity to speak to Cairo at this moment, which is obviously what we're all looking forward to do. And Adaf Souif is the cultural commentator, author of the best-selling The Map of Love, which was shortlisted for the Booker in 1999. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hi. It's good to be with you.
We're a room of 100, and we're a panellist, very rich with panellists. So let me just ask, does anyone else have a question before I start? Right, okay, you will have in a minute. Would you kindly tell us if the revolution is ongoing? Our panellists have given their thoughts. They said Mubarak's gone, but there needs to be many questions about the military handing over to the military. Does it feel like you're in the middle with more to come, Adaf Souif?
It feels like we're at the beginning. I mean, we've done, we've moved the major, thing. The necessary condition has happened, because without Mr. Mubarak's going, nothing could happen. But now there's a lot to do, and of course, we all accept that the military is the best option right now, and we also believe that they do not at the moment want to take over and establish a military regime, but we also know that we have to get out of this stage extremely quickly, and that is very much what Friday is going to be about. I'm
going to ask Lindsay Hilsum to ask you a question, who was raising the line I've just stolen about the military handing over to each other.
Adaf, it's Lindsay here.
Hello.
Tell us a bit about Friday then. When I left a couple of days ago, I was told Friday was going to be a huge party, a big celebration. Is it going to have more meaning now? What are the aims of the big gathering in Tahrir Square on Friday?
Yeah, well, actually, the aims have been formulated during this last week or during the last few days. There are the very immediate aims which are going to be everywhere, which are that we want the detained people returned. We believe that we are missing about 2,000 people, and we need to have them back, know where they are, know who's dead and who isn't. That's number one. Number two is the removal of the emergency laws. Number three is the removal of the cabinet, which is of course the cabinet that the regime left in place. And number three is that there should be a new cabinet born out of the revolution put in place. And over the last 2 days, it's been impossible, of course, to have a sort of general consensus of the revolution to put forward, for example, the names of the cabinet, because this has just been such an organic, grassroots, sort of broad-based thing. But there have been at least 3 initiatives from different sectors of the revolution which have put forward the names of potential prime ministers, and also a long list, if you like, about 100 to 150 names of people that the prime minister can pick a cabinet from. And when you look at the lists, there is about 70% agreement between them.
And Dr. Maha Azam is here.
Hello, Ahdaf.
Hi.
Hi. I saw you in Tahrir but never made it to you. You were on a platform, and it's good to hear from you. I think that what you're saying about the new cabinet is very important as a demand, but I am a little bit worried about this whole issue of the military. I wonder whether the Egyptian people as a whole tend to see the military in too good a light. The whole issue of the people and the army are one is a very good slogan. The army did take a good position, especially the rank and file during these protests. But I'm considering the top brass of the army and their ambitions, and to what extent we should really trust to this extent.
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is a very good question, and it's one which is being asked a lot. And to that, I can really only point you at the pragmatics, if you like, of the current situation. So you can look at the military in 2 ways. You can look at them as a body that has actually ruled in Egypt since 1952. And also you can look at them as a body that controls, 30% of Egyptian GDP, and that wants to retain this position. But also they have a history, and they have a history of that twice they were ordered to fire on Egyptian protesters in 77 and 85, and they refused. Also, they are made up of the brothers and sons and fathers of people in the country and so on. So basically, right now, we have the military in power. Their declared position is that they are caretakers of the revolution and that they will never raise arms against Egyptian protesters. So, the Egyptian position or the Egyptian attitude is to say, we believe you. You and us are one. We are very grateful you're there. We rely on you, and we believe that it is now your responsibility to protect this situation. However, we would like to move to a civil government and the civil situation very, very soon, and these are our demands. So there's no point in now standing up and saying to the military, well, actually, we don't trust you. They're there. And we have no reason immediately to not trust them. And so you saw what happened, that when they came down to the streets, people basically gathered around the tanks, and people have been around and on top of the tanks, have been engaging the military, have been making them feel that they are part of the revolution, have been insisting on kind of extending a human hand to them. And, I think that this is very savvy. I think it's very wise. And at the same time, we are pushing hard. And Friday, we'll see, we've been working on banners here. Friday, we'll see a very determined push to move the country towards a civil government.
I'm stepping on your toes just to bring everyone in. Thank you. Dr. Omar Ashur.
Hi, Ahdaf. This is Omar. I just wanted to ask about the state security as an institution. I know there was this demand of dissolving the state security. It is more or less responsible for executing the 30 years of repression of Mubarak as the evil minds, if you wish, and the central security as the muscles. So from what I gather so far, they are functioning as excellent as always. I don't know if there is any attempt to undermine them by the military or to blame them for the current crisis. So just some lights on the relation with the military and if there is any move towards undermining them.
There's a central demand that the state security مباحث أمن الدولة is removed. It's disbanded as an organization. We believe that we don't need it. And there is also a demand, and actually a case has been put in front of the Attorney General that the use of conscripts for central security services is illegal, because you can, if you have conscripts, they should be used for the army to defend the independence of the country and its borders, and so to use them in sort of for Ministry of the Interior to beat Egyptian protesters is illegal, unconstitutional, and we have put forward a demand saying they either get taken over by the army, or if they're not needed, then they're disbanded. So this is an extremely important demand, and it might not happen right now, but it will happen with the new cabinet.
And Peter Beaumont.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me about my time in Tahrir Square was just, and also on the demonstrations trying to reach it, was just a huge number of women who were involved. And yet, today I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the commission that's been talked about on constitutional reform doesn't include a single woman.
Well, the commission that the army has put in place for constitutional reform is again very much open to question. There are several opinions here. A lot of us, and I among them, believe that constitutional reform should not be carried out right now under the auspices of essentially the army and a government that is a remnant of the old regime, and that is something that should be put on ice until we have an interim cabinet born of the revolution, and then there would be a proper elected, if you like, or selected with much greater care, founding council of at least 40 people that would work on a new constitution. Now, others are saying, well, the army has already put this small committee in place, and some of them are people that are very well respected, and so why kind of push it away? They will only carry out small reforms, enough to take you to elections, and then you can sit down and basically rework the constitution. And when you come down to it, when you really ask people who, with all these divergent opinions, what they think, it turns out that the general consensus is that the constitution of 1923 is an excellent base from which to start. And so really the committee that has now been put in place by the army is not one that one would, they might do something small that would help us along right now, but they're not the final and real founding council that is going to rewrite the Egyptian constitution.
Okay, and before we bid you goodbye, there's a question from the audience here. Can you wait for the microphone? And if there's another question, we can also take that. But if you just lean back a second, Adaf Suif, we can see your face and we can know who we're talking to better.
I'm sorry. This is the first time I've done this on Skype. I have no idea how to do it.
You need light on your face. You need your son or whoever was there to shine a light on your face.
That's very nice.
You're
we saw you there briefly for a moment.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
You're shining a light on us, but we want to shine one back. So here's a question from our audience in London. Would you kindly introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Ahlam Akram, and I'm so concerned about the constitution reform. What's the party's views regarding Article 2 in particular in the Egyptian constitution, and whether this article does exist in the 1923 constitution which you just mentioned, because this article alone, as you know, confirmed that all the laws are derived from Sharia law, and I mean that will not be compatible with human rights in general. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not a constitutional expert. What I understand is that the article, as it was deemed acceptable before, said that Islamic Sharia is a source or a major source of the legislation in Egypt, but it was not the only source. And of course, Article 2 is one that has been mutilated, and it's one of the articles that are that will most need debate and articulation. But of course, there is a great push, and I don't think anybody will accept that it delineates Sharia as the one and only source of legislation in Egypt. That just is not possible.
Okay, now we'll discuss this more as we go on. Adaf Suif, thank you very much for joining us. one day we'll bring you a torch. And but we've no, you've illuminated us. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much. Can I come to you in just a second in the audience? Panellists, will one of you make the worst case? I could hear your doubts there, Maha in particular from you, but all of you, let's just make the worst case. We hear state security need to be disbanded, but they're not. We want women, there aren't any. We want a constitution, the army are going to go tinkering, we don't want that. There may be 2,000 people missing, large numbers of whom may be dead. What revolution is this? You begin, and then we'll come to you. Maha.
So my worry about the army is that I think we need to be open about this. It's fine tactically for the Egyptian people not to attack the army head on. That's fine, but we're here in London, and let's say it plain. The army was the main support of the Mubarak regime, of the Sadat regime, and it's been in power since '52. So tactically, the protesters are playing it right. Yes, the army is made up of the husbands, sons and fathers of the people, and that's brilliant. But in a way, we have to demystify the army, and there is a lot of they're blown out of all proportion, as if there's a mythology about the army. And in a sense, if you're going to venture into a democratic process, there needs to be transparency of all institutions, including the military.
Lindsay?
Well, I think that I had a very interesting conversation with a former general just a couple of days ago. And he said that the army is there to guarantee the security of the state. Now, one of the things that they are very concerned about, obviously, is Iran. Iran is the country which they see as their main enemy. And we've seen a very interesting development in Iran, which is that President Ahmadinejad has supported the revolution of the people against the Mubarak regime. That hasn't stopped him from sending out the Basij with the tear gas and the batons yesterday and today for the young people of Iran who were demonstrating in exactly the same way for exactly the same thing. But the military are very concerned about that. They are very concerned about the peace treaty with Israel and continuing the peace treaty with Israel. And I think that in many ways they would like to be doing that, to be dealing with the country's borders and with all of those issues. Now, obviously, it's completely new for them to be dealing with people like Wael Khonim, the Google executive who started the Facebook site We Are All Khalid Saeed, which is in many ways believed to have started this whole thing. But I do believe that they want to get back to their primary function. I don't think that they want to run Egypt in the way that they're having to do at the moment.
I mean, the army has got a narrative that you'd hear from the officers in Cairo, which is like, we're there to protect people and we're there to protect the state, which a lot of people take on board. But at the same time, I mean, senior members of the military hierarchy who haven't, fought a war for, nearly 30 years, if not more. I mean, their fundamental functions, they're involved in business, they're involved in the political elites, they're involved in the regime. And my impression by the end of it was that I was not convinced at all that they were playing a terribly straight game, because on the one hand, what the senior generals are seeing is they're getting hit in their pockets by the closure of Egypt's economy, and at the same time we're saying, well, we're going to look after you, it's the cops who are the bad guys, it's some of the people in the ruling party. And actually at the end of it, I don't think the army have played terribly straight. I mean, certainly my own experience, Lindsay alluded to it earlier, I didn't get roughed up, but like a lot of journalists, I got detained by the army, along with a colleague from The Guardian. They didn't want us reporting that. These are not people whose orders were terribly in service of democracy.
Yeah, but
they did not want.
But the West's been tinkering in their country since time immemorial. Why should they want you there and a bunch of other old people wandering around the place? I mean,
well, absolutely. But at the same time, if we're talking about a proper revolution, a revolutionary change, and democracy, a lot of things that people are talking about.
But the great distrust of foreigners, surely, based on 1950s, based on as far back as you want to go, Omar.
Just, it is really wrong to black box the army and think of it as one unit. There is a serious security dilemma within the army itself, and I think that explains a lot of the conflicting behavior of it. sometimes basically, to summarize, the senior ranks were leaning towards Mubarak. They have a lot of links to Mubarak. They get a lot of benefits from Mubarak. The junior ranks from the very beginning, they weren't more or less leaning towards the population. I have a friend of mine who was stationed in front of the TV station, and from day one he was stationed. I called him and I asked him, how is your reaction going to be if things heat up? And he said, in no way I'm going to give orders to my unit to fire on people. And I think that was a common trend among mostly majors and below. And at this point, the seniors did not want a mutiny in the army. The juniors were still fearing the seniors, and I guess that security dilemma within the army is what held it together to a large degree.
Right. The junior officers that I met were all very, very hands off. We're here just to keep the peace. But it's what happens higher up the food chain, and that's what was so unknowable. And I was in Tahrir Square when the jets buzzed and the squadron of tanks trying to move into the square. I mean, I don't know what those orders were, but there were orders to clear the square that day of some kind.
Yeah, I have to say that my personal experience, I was arrested by the army and I was incredibly grateful, because that was when a mob had surrounded our car and were trying to drag us out and beat us up, and rarely have I been so happy to be arrested. But the army were the ones who did it and took us in and treated us with extreme courtesy. So my own personal experience is very good, but I agree with Peter that that's an experience at a certain level, and the higher up level is a different thing.
Just on the point of is this a revolution or not, we're still in day 5.
Yes.
It took basically to change Egypt from a semi-democracy to a full-fledged military dictatorship by Nasser. It took 2 years, between 52 and 54. 1919 to change it from an absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy. It took 4 years, between 1919 and 1923. So this is still day 5. We saw a lot of the most notorious figures in the regime gone. Habib al-Adli is held in the infamous interior minister is held in the defense ministry building. Others, Jamal Mubarak, Izzuddin, Hosni Mubarak himself, all to a large degree put on the side. It did not really change the regime yet, but it's because many of the figures are still there. But again, this is day 5.
I mean, Martin Wolf, I think, in the Financial Times made a very good distinction today. What we've seen is a passionate revolt. What we haven't seen yet is a revolution. And I think it's a really important distinction in terms of the words that we use about this, because revolution suggests that there is a completeness to it. And we've seen the revolt, but we haven't seen the revolution yet.
And let's just say that to you now in the room, the question, what now for Egypt, that Peter's putting, you're saying, what now is the moment that you want to discuss? So let's do 15 minutes on this. To you at the back of the room, you've explained your fears about the army, and we'll take this a seemingly long time to come up to you, because you've kindly given your views from the back of the room when there's plenty of people here at the front. Thank you for explaining your differences on the army. Please confine yourself to predictions or questions about what now for Egypt.
Okay, Paddy.
On the microphone would be appreciated.
All right, we are not seeing the fall of the wall. We're seeing something much less than that. And I take your point, sir. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name.
Omar and Peter.
Omar. I take your point that we're in day 5, and a lot of people are making quite deterministic statements about what might or might not happen. But I don't feel it's as big as the fall of the wall. I think it's still to develop, and I'm worried that it will snap back quite quickly.
I mean, my reaction to this is, you look at the Otpor revolution against Milosevic. I mean, it removed Milosevic, but how much did it change Serbian society? You look at the colour revolutions in places like Georgia and Ukraine. I mean, people who were involved in some way in the elites are still running the place. There hasn't been a comprehensive revolution in some of these places, even over the period of a decade.
So you agree?
And yet, Maho made a point. People have overcome their fear, and I think that is a huge issue. Everyone was terrified. Everyone was terrified to speak. They're no longer terrified to speak, and I think that is a revolution in itself.
And to you in the room, it's a public meeting. Do you fear it could slip back? Do you say it's not big enough yet and it may become smaller?
Yes, because the system's ingrained. It's deeply riven into the structure.
I think the coming few days will show how much ingrained it is, because the state security apparatus, if it was dissolved, if the emergency laws were removed, if we saw like a more of a sacking of this government, or at least the guys who were very close to Mubarak, like Ahmed Shafiq, the prime ministers, then we will see like deinstitutionalization of de-Baathification, although it's a bad word, but it's like we'll see something similar. But otherwise, it might be more of.
My hope is the real-time nature of what we're seeing. I mean, I was on Sunday morning on the iPhone watching live coverage, the Al Jazeera live coverage. I think the real-time nature of what we're seeing is a hope, but I fear that it will snap back and that we won't see the change that everybody's talking about.
Okay, and here you are. Here's a question. Here we are. Here's a microphone for you. Here you are. No, you've got a microphone.
You need a microphone.
We want to hear you. Go on. Say what. You're from the Foreign Office. What? Can you give the gentleman a microphone? Here you are, sir. Off you go. Right, okay, well, I'm afraid you do need to speak on the microphone, or don't speak at all. And to you there in the back there. It's a public meeting, no one's ruled out, everyone's ruled in. Over to you.
Hi, Angus McSwan from Reuters. I'd like to ask a question rather than give a view, but I wonder if you could address the foreign reaction to what happened, particularly the Americans, who just seemed confused the whole way through, the Israelis, who possibly missed an opportunity to reach out to the Arab world, and the Saudis, who are obviously shitting themselves. So, do you have any sort of recommendations for how they would deal with Egypt going forward, but also the other countries that are now, 5 or 6 protesting today?
Okay, can we come to those neighbours question in just 10 minutes, but will you deal with the reaction to Egypt, Maha, from abroad?
Well, I think, yes, the US reaction was muddled at first, but I still say that Mr. Obama's position eventually was much more than one could have ever expected. There has been a shift, and maybe I stand alone in this opinion, but I felt that the United States had come a long way. For its own agenda. Mubarak had become a liability. There was a necessary shift. It decided to address the Egyptian people, not the regime. It made the right moves. Yes, staggering there, but it did eventually. I think the United States has to play this very carefully. It mustn't meddle, and it still wants to meddle somehow through pro-democracy funding, through support for democratic and secular forces if there are free and fair elections. I think the United States has been a very important player in terms of putting pressure on the military not to shoot on civilians. Not that the Egyptian military wanted to shoot, but that the United States also reminded them that they mustn't shoot, because then it won't be able to argue their case in terms of continued aid to the military.
Maha, can I ask, in the terms of what now for Egypt, how important are external factors raised by our friend, and how versus the internal one? And Omar, perhaps you'll pick up.
External factors in terms of US support, you mean?
And other countries in the world.
Well, US support is vital in terms of aid, absolutely, and ongoing aid, particularly an economic package, which is something that they're obviously thinking about. And they don't want Egypt to fall to bits. They want to continue the aid to the military, which is in close alliance with the United States, and also in order to fund some kind of economic recovery in Egypt. So it is vital, yes.
Omar and Lindsay?
Yes, I think it's quite important as well. And also, in addition to what Maha said, the legal dimension of this, there's 326 people that were killed, thousands were wounded, many were maimed, disappearances. I think if just a few generals were placed on an international watch list, many of them will think twice before committing another massacre in Egypt.
Okay, so we'll finish up with this in about 5 minutes. To you, sir, in the audience.
Yeah, I mean, this has got to be challenge aid. What aid? I mean, there's reports by Jewish intelligence websites that the Egyptian generals were in the Pentagon when the revolt happened. I mean, this interference by Western imperialist forces has got to end. I mean,
that's a very interesting point. I had coffee with a Zimbabwean friend the other day, and we talked about why this happened in Egypt now and it didn't happen in Zimbabwe in the year 2000. And she said it's because of you buggers, because you paid too much attention to us, and because the British government was piping up the whole time. She said, and so we sat back and we waited for Western intervention. And that meant that nothing happened. Now, of course, technologically, we were in a different situation there because it was pre-Facebook and so on. One of the most important things about what's happened in Egypt is they did it themselves. The Americans played this confusing, dithering role. The British sort of fluttered about in that British way. The Israelis went, oh my God, what the hell is happening now? And the Egyptians did it. The Egyptian people, or a large sector of the Egyptian people, did it. And I don't think that that can be denied. Now, that means that all the foreign forces are then rushing to catch up. One of the things that Mubarak did immediately was he said, this is foreign forces. All the journalists are Israeli spies. There are all foreigners in the square. Egyptians knew that that wasn't true. And that is one of the reasons why I think that they achieved what they have achieved.
Can I just finish my point? The point I'm trying to make is these dictatorial regimes, they are an instrument to implement neoliberal economic policies which are coming from bankrupt Western nations, and the people are revolting against that.
Okay, from the panel, anyone disagree or agree?
No, I mean yes and no. I mean on the one hand, the consequence of some of these regimes, the way they are, is because of bankrupt neoliberal policies. But you know, like all unhappy families, these are people who've actually pursued their own aims. You can't just simply say it's the West doing it. You know, Mubarak, Ben Ali, these are people who have gone out and actually interpreted, you know, these kind of external policies in their own and very, very corrupt and violent ways. And I don't think you can completely say, oh, it's Washington, it's London, it's Paris.
Okay.
I mean, these are people who completely collaborated in this and actually found new ways to make it unpleasant.
Okay, so we're coming. We're going to end this off by. Will you give us your briefing, please, on this question? What now for Egypt? And we'll move on to the neighbours. We want dates. I want to hear Friday. I want to hear people. We want a briefing from you. Where do we look next? Is it strikes? Which cities are we looking for? Name people for us, and then we'll move on. Maha, to you first.
Oh, that's really fair. All right. What next? I think pockets of strikes all over Egypt, because I think the revolution is yet to come. I think for me, I'll see a revolution when I can see more workers, more employees from various public sectors saying we want our rights too, which we've seen some of. I think that is a symbol of the democratization, not just a symbol of instability, although it may contribute to economic woes and instability. It's a sign of Egypt waking up, and I think we might see more of it unless the army actually clamps down on that, and that is a fear, because already the signs are there. They don't want disruption. They said no to strikes, and they said if you don't listen, we'll find a way of making you listen in one way or another through the fifth communique. You can correct me on that if I'm wrong. And so there is a danger there. But if Egypt is going to open up, and I think there is no real turning back, I think something has broken and people will want more. The demands, as we heard from Ahdaf, are very much there. Those demands are going to grow. And so the military is going to have to respond, but we're going to keep seeing the military trying to keep control and keep a lid on the situation. Its interests are there, very vested interests, and those are going to be very difficult to deal with.
I think Maha's absolutely right. I spoke to a number of people involved in different businesses in Egypt at the beginning. There was a guy who ran a PVC window company who said to me, I'm losing the equivalent of $10,000 a week, but the price is worth it. I spoke to people who ran tourist businesses who said, we could go bust in 2 or 3 months, but it's worth it. And I think there's a realisation amongst these people at a certain level of Egyptian society that perhaps has never been engaged before, who say, look, it's worth paying the price for a better society. The other point that she made is that everyone says we've broken through the fear barrier, and I think that is crucial.
Yes, just to give one example from the ground, the man who gave, there was this guy who owns a tourist company that obviously was pretty much undermined because of the whole situation in Tahrir Square. But this same man gave this tourist company to the command in Tahrir Square, basically all this youth going there, meeting twice per day to organize Tahrir Square protest inside this tourist company, and he was a loser in short term, but obviously in long term he believed that he's a winner. But I think we will be seeing like mini revolts all over Egypt in the coming few days and weeks, mainly because the expectations were not met. As we saw, like there's too many demands that were not met, and I think the Egyptian people are not ready to give up on, or the majority of them at least, are not ready to give up on those demands yet.
Do you see the army controlling the population further?
I think that the implicit threats from the army were there from the very beginning. They were giving also always this hint, we're going to use violence. But I think part of it, this security dilemma that I spoke about, part of it also has to do with we have to give it to Obama's administration, because really they have been holding the shoulder of the military for a while from the very beginning. The central commander was there, Sami Anan was there on a visit with a lot of senior commanders when the protest started, and I think it was made to him very clearly that there is a lot of interest for the military, there is a lot of training equipment, there's 1.3 billion paid annually to the Egyptian military, and all this may be undermined if you use violence against peaceful protesters.
They didn't use violence. It's going to be very difficult to use violence now, isn't it?
I think one of the ways in which the military will try and satisfy the people will be through corruption trials, because corruption is one of the biggest issues which people were protesting about. And we've already seen that Ahmad Az, who was the Secretary General of the party and a big steel magnate very close to Mubarak and one of the most hated men in Egypt, he's already under house arrest. They're already trying to freeze they've requested his assets to be frozen overseas. He's going to go on trial. Significant former ministers are going to go on trial, although it appears not Mubarak himself. And that, I think, is one of the ways in which the military will try and keep people happy. I think that there definitely will be strikes, a rise of strikes. I think that the other thing which the military will try and do is deal with opposition parties like the WAF party and so on, who they're used to and who they know how to deal with. And it's going to be up to the April the 6th movement and all the young people, the coalition of people who are in the square, to say no. Those are the traditional opposition, but we are the new opposition, and they are going to have to keep at it, and they're going to have to be very clever to constantly say we have to be included in decision making. And that, I think, is going to be one of the most difficult things in this nexus between the old power, which is the military, and the new power, which is the people in the square.
But the military gave quite a good hint in that sense, because they met first with the coalition folks, the youth coalition, as opposed to the Wafdists and the others. So.
And can I ask you in the room, if you've come here to answer the question, what now for Egypt, is it being answered? I propose to move on. If it's not, would you kindly let me know what you need to know from the panel? To you, sir, and then to you at the front here, yes. Sorry, madam, but you're completely hidden.
Yes, good evening. My name is Saskia Terzani. I'm just wondering, we're discussing now the role between the old regime and the new seems to be just represented by the pro-democracy people. What do you consider to be the role now of a more fundamentalist Muslim political body? Isn't that also another element that should be considered, that perhaps the more fundamentalist Muslim religious side may want to leverage on this slightly unstable situation and make greater leeways in Egyptian politics?
I mean, I think it's been overstated. And I think it's been overstated by people with different agendas, particularly who would like to say, oh, if you get rid of the dictator, you're going to end up with a kind of different kind of Islamist dictatorship. I mean, one of the first things that the Muslim Brotherhood said was that it wasn't interested in the presidency. It was interested in forming partnerships with secular parties. And actually, there was a very good column in Zaman today by Ihsan Dagi, Turkish commentator, saying actually there's a middle way. It doesn't have to be a dictatorship, it doesn't have to be Islamist, it can be more like Turkey.
Right, and to you, man?
I think that's one of the things I want to ask. I mean, basically what you don't have in the revolutionaries, for want of a better word, is leadership. In other words, look, anything is possible. Look, if Obama had gone to election 8 years ago, he'd never have got elected. It's timing. You have this energy, you have this force, but you have no young leader with a clear value system and a clear direction saying this is the way to go forward. And that's why this is all dissipating, because nobody's got this clear avenue as to where to go next.
I think this is a point of strength, not weakness, because we saw the charismatic leadership and what it did to Egypt before. 36 years old Nasser, basically destroyed what was left of the democratic institutions of Egypt and headed to a military dictatorship. So I think the decentralization is quite critical right now. Can I say something about the Muslim Brothers?
Yes.
Very, very quickly.
Please.
Again, don't...
in the context of what now?
Yeah, what now? Yeah, don't black box them again. The younger generation of the brothers is just closer to any other political activists in Tahrir Square, whether liberals or leftists, than to the older generation of the Muslim Brothers. They basically formed again their own command in Tahrir Square, and I think their role will be very critical in the coming few months, because they are basically the movers and the shakers. Now they are the ones who basically tell the grassroots we go out or not. The senior command, to a large degree, it's there, and it's leading political activists and everything, but I don't think they have much control over the younger generation.
Right, but you're saying their role will grow, to answer the lady in the audience, the role of the Muslim Brothers is going to grow.
The more open-minded younger ones, their role will
To you at the back, madam.
Adaf Swaif referred to, was it 4 presidential candidates on the list for the pro-democracy movement? Can you tell us who they are? And can you just give us an idea of the scope of the constitutional changes needed to move on to some sort of even semi-democracy?
Who are the candidates?
Would it be Baradei?
Baradei, Amr Musa, Ayman Noor, I expect will try, and another.
Well, that's that's popping out. Do any of you know who the fourth one is?
The fourth Batal Waft?
I don't think Sayyid Badawi is.
We can only name three.
He has a chance.
So there are candidates.
Nobody knows.
Okay,
So there are no formal elections.
Right, we can only name 3. The panel are embarrassed; they can only name 3. But the second part of your question was, what was the spectrum of? What was the spectrum?
How much constitutional change is needed? Is it huge? Is it?
Okay, Maha, how much is needed?
I think they're looking at particular articles in order to limit the power of the president. So they're looking at also the one related to emergency, looking at Article 76, 78, if that means anything, and 88, is that right?
197.
Okay, so basically they're looking at a few articles. They're saying they can do it in 10 days, basically. So that's why Adaf Swaif is right. In a sense, there is a problem with that, but they want to get away from some of the blocks, if you like, to moving on and having a transitional government and moving on to a civilian government, and assuming that probably the constitution will be revised again.
Okay, 2 more questions on Egypt and then we're moving on.
Following up on the leaderlessness question, obviously one party is no good, but 100 parties isn't good either. How is this going to form into a nice, say, 4 to 6 coalition or party type structure? I mean, do you see a prospect for this happening? Do you see the beginnings of this, or is it just too early to tell?
I think it will be a process of building coalitions. Again, it's the whole process now is 24 days. Mubarak stepped down 5 days ago, and they are working on it 24 hours basically. But I'm quite glad that this is happening. The coalition process with that pace in Egypt is a revolutionary thing. If anyone remembers the 90s in Egypt, or the 2000s even, basically you had a fight by guns within one party to control an office in a building. So this exclusionary mentality, the idea of no collective action, no teamwork, this is all gone off the window, and now we're seeing something very different.
Yeah, but can you give him a timescale? Will there be elections in September? Is there a referendum before then? I think we're all here for a briefing, Omar. We want to know, are we scheduled for elections?
I don't think they can delay. They can't delay the elections beyond September.
So we've got elections in September.
Yes, definitely. Maybe even before.
And will there be leaders? This gentleman wants to know: will there be identifiable leaders by September?
Yeah, there may be a junior officer that emerges.
Can I just say, this is a Western media obsession.
There will be a big problem.
You saw it in Tahrir Square when Baradei turned up, and CNN and all sorts of other people went, Baradei's here. Oh, it's brilliant. He's going to be the next leader of Egypt. But you know what? The great thing about what happened at Tahrir Square and around, and also in Tunisia, is everywhere you went, there were groups of people standing around having often ferocious arguments about the way forward for Egypt. So why don't we just give them a little bit of time instead of imposing a leadership from outside of the country that we think suits us? Sorry.
No, quite right. I agree with you.
My question is, we've been discussing so far what's happening in Egypt pretty much in isolation or focus within the country. My question is, if there are, let's say, this is the Berlin Wall of the Arab world, and even Iran and other regimes fall, how will that provide a positive feedback to what happens in Egypt going forward?
So you've moved us on. Thank you for doing that. So now we're going into the second part. It's neighbours in the Middle East. Peter, would you like to start?
Yeah. I was in Tunisia before I went to Cairo. The news from Tunis isn't very, very good. you would like to see the revolution continuing. There are lots and lots of blocking factors. We tend to look at this as being kind of like a domino effect across the region, but every single country has different issues. I mean, look at Jordan. I mean, Jordan has got a 60%, am I right, Palestinian population. The kind of factors that are going to come into play in Jordan are not the same factors that are going to come into play in Iran. They're not the same factors in Egypt. What we should try and do is look at each of these countries as individual countries with individual social problems. Some of them are universal, some of them are not.
Around that one.
Yeah. Can I say something? No. No, I'm just gonna. I agree, but there's one extra bit that the repression and violent repression unites people from very different backgrounds. It's the first time in Egypt I saw, Coptic feminist lady, cooperating quite well with Muslim Brothers young activists, and it wasn't a problem at all. And I think one of the leading issues, whether even in the Iranian Revolution, is that the Shah made everybody angry, and therefore you had leftists cooperating with Ayatollah Khomeini. What happens in the transition period is something else, but I think we might see at least upheavals as we saw now in Libya, Bahrain, and Jordan and Yemen.
Peter urges us to look at countries differently. So Maha, will you pick two very different examples and tell us perhaps why they tell us a different part of the story? Would you prefer to ignore my question and pick one? But tell us.
No, I won't ignore your question. I actually think there is a sort of a degree of uniformity in the protests. I don't think at this stage there are differences. There are differences in the contexts, yes, and how it may evolve. But in a sense, all these protesters are rising up against authoritarian regimes. They want to speak out. They want to bring the regimes down. They have similar goals. And maybe in Jordan, for example, they won't express the fact, or they don't want the monarchy to end, but they want to have some kind of constitutional parliament and free and fair elections, for example. So perhaps they don't want complete regime change in Jordan as in Egypt, but I don't know. They may well do. But I'm saying in terms of the protests, there is uniformity. I think eventually we're going to see a country like even Saudi Arabia, where people are going to call for political reform, perhaps in ways that are different, but you're going to see it from middle class elements that are more secular. I mean secular in quotes in Saudi Arabia, and Islamists that also want to have greater transparency, greater accountability, greater participation. So all these things, I think, run across the board in the region.
And I think it is also a question to how these governments react to what's going on. Because you have governments like, for example, in Libya and Syria, which are extremely hard line. But Syria has now, liberated Facebook and Twitter, which it hadn't had before. But you can expect them to cling on come what may. You have what's happening in Bahrain at the moment. Well, we've had 2 protesters killed in the last 2 days. But the king went on television yesterday to say there was going to be an inquiry. Maybe there is some kind of compromise in Bahrain, I don't know. There might be a compromise which would involve having less, not having the same discrimination against the Shias. The Prime Minister, who's been there for far too long, going. In some countries, they may be able to preempt a total overthrow. One of the issues about Egypt was that rigid stability led to instability because Mubarak was so inflexible right up to the last moment. That's what made the situation brittle. That's what made everything break. Now, all of these leaders in this region will be looking now to work out how to be. Now, some of them only know one way to be, which is as brittle as that. Others will be looking, and we see this in Jordan, where in Jordan they are trying to be a little bit flexible in the hope that they can bend and not break.
Can I ask you on the panel if this is a useful distinction? If you are backed by the West, with aid, with words, you have to be a lot less brutal. It's the countries who are pariah states in the eyes of the West who can be more brutal. Peter, would you say that's a way of looking at it?
I've been thinking about it in a completely different way today. I was thinking about sort of statement by Hillary Clinton, the State Department, when they launched the Farsi news service. And brutality or not brutality, you can control people in all sorts of different ways through violence or mind control. But the thing that I've been most struck by is how, in comparison with Egypt and Tunisia, some wished for revolutions are more important than other revolutions, and you look at that in Iran. And I have to admit that to me, the Clinton intervention I thought was incredibly unhelpful, because actually what you want is a homegrown revolution in Iran that doesn't have the taint of the State Department.
Does it imply to you that this is a drug the West can't wean itself off? It just has to, it sees intervention and has to go for the jug.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I kind of think that there's this kind of narrative about sort of, bringing democracy and we should be on the right side. And actually, it's an old idea, a very old idea, and that actually people should be able to try and work it through their own cultures and their own ideas.
But I think the involvement is to do with the fear of losing their interests. I think it's much more that than even ideological. It's a matter, I've got to get in there, we've got to be involved, especially for the United States, because we have to have a hold on things, whether it's through an authoritarian regime or now through democracy. We've got to be in there to control things so that our interests are, we keep our interests and we sustain that. That's why they're so desperate to know also who the next leader is going to be. I mean, the US is obsessed with this because they want to be able to get in there and connect with this new leader, or to see what they need to do. Is it coming from a slightly Islamist trend, or is it, which it won't, I don't think, or is it coming, who is it? What are his ideas? Is he particularly nationalist? Is he anti-Israel? They're very concerned about this.
Okay, to you in the audience.
Thank you. James White from the LSE. In terms of both Egypt and its relationships with its neighbours, I'm wondering the impact on tourism, the impact on industry, production and trade. What are the long-term and short-term economic consequences of this? And will whatever regime or leadership that comes to power be critically constrained by the economic damage that's happening now?
Omar, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, sure. The army is issuing all kind of statements about the necessity of stopping protests and stopping strikes and demonstrations and going back to work, because in their words, it's going to collapse. The economy of Egypt cannot take it anymore. And I guess this is one of the critical issues right now. Egypt's internal debt is $183 billion. So it's a huge amount. The amount that left the country, I think there's an estimate about $200 billion, so which again, it's a huge amount. Not talking about the damage that for the tourist industry. So I think in the short term, I think the economy will be undermined and it won't look gloomy. But on the long term, if this this revolution succeeds, if we have a transparent, accountable government that can be monitored by a representative of the people, I think on the long term, the Egyptian economy will pick up.
Okay, and remind everyone, we're trying to talk about the neighbours now. Libya, there's been a crackdown in the second city. Iran, there's someone's been shot. They can't even agree who he is. So, I mean, to you now.
Yes, I also wanted to raise the economic question, not just for Egypt, but for the whole region. There's a particularly interesting article in today's Guardian by someone called El Hassan bin Talal, who is a Royal Highness of somewhere or other. Doesn't actually say what country, but nevertheless, the article suggests that, among other things, we need a supranational community for water and energy for the human environment, an Arab equivalent of the European coal and steel community. And that struck me as being a very constructive suggestion. I've thought for a long time that what the Middle East needs is something like the European Union to get rid of the of some of the conflicts. But one other very quick word: no one's mentioned Israel yet.
Right. Well, you just have. So, who will begin on the reaction or the effect on Israel? Would you, Maha, like to begin?
I think it's very telling that we haven't mentioned Israel yet, and that is because it is such a domestic issue. That these protests, in a sense, were very much to do with regime change. And even in the square, I think that this is important, that Israel didn't feature. There were, as many have said before me, I mean, the Israeli flag was not burnt, the American flag was not burnt. This was about something else. It's about a different struggle, at least at this stage. That is not to say that the whole issue of nationalism is not very strong. It is extremely strong among secular Egyptians and Islamists alike, and it has become very, very clear that the whole issue of the peace treaty with Israel is not something that's going to be torn up. But there are many who feel that it ought to be revised. And this is not only from among the Muslim Brotherhood. There are secularists and nationalists who will say this agreement happened, this treaty was signed at a time when Egypt was not a democracy. I've just heard it today interviewing someone. This happened when Egypt was not a democracy, and no, we have a right perhaps to revise it. Now, whether that happens is another matter. A government in power has to take into account issues of security and so on. So I don't think the peace with Israel is going to be over, but it will become even colder.
Can everyone on the panel address this question, starting with you, Lindsay?
Yeah, well, I think that there's been a lot of hypocrisy in Israel, because Israel for many years has liked to say, well, we're the only democracy in the Middle East and the rest of them are dictatorships and how terrible this is, at the same time as being hell of a relieved that they're dictatorships which mean that Israeli ministers can have one-on-one relationships with these people and not actually have to deal with the anger and frustration about the Palestinian question, which we know exists throughout many people, if not the majority of people in the Middle East. So this is going to be a problem for them. Obviously, in terms of Egypt, the key issue is going to be Gaza and whether the border with Gaza will be kept closed or not kept closed. And the last Egyptian government was very clear, and it arranged everything with Israel and it kept it closed. But there's going to have to be some kind of evolution and maturity about this. And if Israel really wants to live amongst its neighbours, and if it wants it as it claims, and we heard Danielle on the other day on the Today programme saying, oh yes, well, it's very good that Egypt's going to be a democracy. Well, if they want that, then maybe they're going to have to change some of their internal policies. And we know that the election which brought Hamas to power in Gaza was a democratic election. I was there. Doesn't mean that the right people won, whatever your point of view is, but it was a genuine election, and Hamas did genuinely win, whatever you think about Hamas. And we're going to have another Palestinian election now before September. Israel's going to have to make some decisions about how it deals with that.
I think Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times said it better than I possibly could have. He said, at the moment of the Egyptian people rising up and asking for democracy and freedom, which Israel says it's the only democracy in the region, is always lamenting it. The Israeli government chose to stand with the pharaoh, not with the people, and I thought that was an absolutely superb point, because they wanted Mubarak. They didn't want instability as they define it, and I think Christoph was spot on about that.
I think it's one of the reasons there is a short sight in this. I think on the long term, it will be beneficial even for Israel to deal with a democratically elected government than being perceived as the enemy of the people all the way. But I think because the cycles of democracy, they have to think short term, because after 4 years it's somebody else's problem. But that on one side. On the other side, there is the issue. I think none of the political opposition in Egypt now said anything about the peace treaty. So even including the Muslim Brothers, they said they will accept it for now. It may be revised later, maybe, but that's it. The others did not even mention it at that point. But I think what we'll be seeing is change, if this the democratic transition occurred, changes towards the policies with regards to Gaza, more or less foreign policy that is, or a tougher diplomacy towards Israel, more or less on the lines of the Turkish AKP stance. But I don't think anyone can afford another war, and more importantly, the military institution itself does not want to get itself into a war. It has a very strong relationship with the US, which is again will press them on this issue. So because of this context, I don't think much will change with regards to Israel, except in diplomatic rhetorical matters.
Can I ask if anyone else in the audience wants to discuss Israel before I move to your question, which may or may not be about Israel? Yes, you've already had a question. Do you mind if I don't? Okay, so would you like anyone to raise a question about this? Okay, madam, would you like to take us on?
Yeah, sure. I guess I have a couple of questions. Thinking about elections coming up, Mubarak was great at checking out international observers. Do you imagine that would be the case going forward post-Mubarak? And then also, I'm curious about what the effect of the other kind of uprisings have been on the protesters themselves. Like, do you think that's really kind of fanning the flames of their excitement and kind of, or do you think it doesn't really actually matter because it's so different different contexts?
I don't know. Sorry. I mean, I met a guy in Tahrir Square who was an Egyptian who'd lived in Tunisia, carrying the Tunisian flag, who everyone absolutely loved. I got an email from a friend in Baghdad a couple of days ago who said, Tunisia, Egypt, now the Iraqis are coming. I mean, I think there's this great kind of cross-circular. I mean, people are so proud in Tunisia to begin with of what they achieved by inspiring other people, and now Egyptians are so proud. I mean, it's just remarkable. It's this sort of what do you call it?
I just
positive feedback.
I just came back from Kuwait, and I said to the Kuwaiti immigration officer that I'm Egyptian. He came out of the booth and gave me a hug. And here we had like a Trafalgar Square a few days ago, a celebration there, and there were hundreds of Egyptians, but thousands of everybody else. So it was.
There was a headline in one of the papers saying how ironic the Egyptians are walking like Tunisians. And we had a meeting here in which there were people who were going to set up a Tunisian party, and I think they felt, hijacked by Egypt because you have this mother of civilization role in the world, don't you? But I wonder if you would comment on that for those of us who are interested in all these different countries. Has Egypt stolen the thunder, and is it seen as the cradle of this revolution now? And is that a relevant question?
Let me sound arrogant. I mean, Egypt.
I'm going to say, two Egyptians. What do you think they're going to say?
It's a discussion. We want the discussion.
I'm not an Egyptian nationalist, but Egypt has always has seen itself as a trendsetter. It's the one that set the path to socialism in the 1960s. Nasser was the leader of the Arab world and Arab nationalism. People around the Arab world often said about Egypt, what's happened to its leadership role, where is Egypt, why won't Egypt rise?
Yeah.
Of course, in terms of its population of over 80 million, it's going to have an impact in terms of its political and strategic weight and so on. So yes, of course, when something happens in Egypt, it's going to have reverberations all over the region, in the same way that when something in Iran happens or in Turkey, there are certain countries in that part of the world that have a greater influence on what happens around them. And Egypt is certainly one of them.
I think, okay, I'll take the Tunisian side. But I think there's a realization among many activists in Egypt that this would never have happened without the Tunisian example, or without Tunisia succeeding, or Tunisians succeeding in removing Ben Ali. And it's realized, I don't know how many times I saw on Twitter or Facebook that this revolution has 3 sponsors: Tunisia, Facebook, and Al Jazeera.
Can I make a point for Iran? 2 years ago, whenever it was, June 2009, I was in Tehran covering the elections and the protests which happened afterwards, and that, of course, was totally clamped down on, and there were 67 people executed in Iran just in January, and 179 executed last year, and 300 something executed the year before, and dozens of journalists and human rights people and all sorts of people who remain in prison now. That is the one that didn't happen because of repression. And I think that one of the interesting things about this new Middle East is that the traditional way of looking at it is that the Persians, that Iran is the enemy of the Gulf, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Sunnis versus the Shias and so on. And yet the fact is that the young people in all of these countries have a lot in common. And that's why we've seen people on the streets in Tehran and in Isfahan and in Tabriz and many other countries over the last couple of days, because they look to Egypt and they see these people with the same aspirations as they have. Now, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish and so on, but there's something in there. There's something in there about those people wanting the same things. The people in the traditional enemies, Persia, the Arab world, wanting the same thing, which to me points to something very different and very new going on.
I mean, I was privileged enough to meet Mohammed Bouaziz's family in Sidi Bouzid towards kind of as the Tunisian revolution was getting a little bit quieter, and I mean the sense of absolute pride in that little poor family about the way that they had inspired, in many ways, that their son had inspired this kind of wave of protests across the Middle East was, something that, I mean, I'm sort of a cynical old hack, but it really did bring a lump to your throat. And
sorry to interrupt, you're talking about the boy who set himself alight.
On fire,
but also it's worth remembering, isn't it, that Ben Ali was photographed with him in the hospital. Just
he
at
was
the,
in a coma at the time. He didn't
Right.
have much choice about it.
No, but it's a reminder. Ben Ali knew at the end
He knew
what
was
this boy
happening.
represented.
He knew what it represented. Yeah.
So, can we say, looking back, can you help us look forward? Are these conditions present in other neighbours that you would like to point us to? Not to treat them the same, but treat them differently. We'll come to the audience in a second, but would you like to raise people, places, regimes which have an interesting point for us to learn from you before we all say goodbye?
There are already multiple people that burned themselves in Algeria. You have a very similar, well, to a large degree, very similar situation, but the only difference is that Algeria went through a horrible civil war during the 1990s, and that started by a cancellation of a democratic process. So they know that they're very close to bad memories, and they know for democracy there's a very high price to pay, and they paid it already in the 90s. I'm not sure if they want to pay it again, but the protest movement, I think it will continue, whether in Libya and in Algeria or Jordan or Yemen or other areas. And there's now a joke circulating in Egypt to all repressed nations from Tahrir Square: if your rulers are bothering you, give us a call.
And there's another one. Can I give you the other joke? Which is in Tunisia they called it Victory Friday, and in Egypt they call it Liberation Friday. So Colonel Gaddafi has banned Fridays.
Okay, to you, sir. Yes.
Ray Bonner, I have a question looking forward and looking to these other countries and looking back from the experience in Egypt and looking forward. What role do you want the United States to play? And I hear, and notwithstanding the accent, Lindsay can vouch that I'm not very American.
Are you un-American?
Ask Lindsay. No, but I hear some tension, conflict, ambivalence among the panel, which doesn't surprise me. From my years as a foreign correspondent, I felt it as well. Peter seems to say, stay out, this is Egypt, don't try to impose your democracy, don't try to impose your president, which I totally understand. Mahas criticizes Obama, as a lot of people did.
No, I didn't. I don't think I did.
He finally staggered. Okay.
No, on the contrary, I think the statements that he made were very good.
Was your word.
At the beginning. But actually, now just make it clear that no, I think that the stand that the Obama administration has taken was exceptional, and we can't ask for more.
Okay.
Go on.
And then Adam says, and I think you said also, they have the hand on the shoulder of the military, and you want them to control the military now, or to keep telling the military what to do. It reminds me a little bit in the Philippines, where they used to have the anti-American demonstrations. Yankee go home, and take me with you. What role do you see the United States playing, or Britain, or Europe? But let's face it, unfortunately, other than China, the United States still has the power.
I'm going to fess up. My wife's an American in the audience who's worked in pro-democracy in the Middle East and who's been giving me a bit of a hard look. And all I would say is be honest. Be honest about what you're doing. If you're really there to bring about democracy and freedom, then do that within the cultures and within the societies. Don't do it because it suits you. Don't do it because it suits your economics. Don't do it because it suits your power relations. Do it because you actually believe that democracy is a thing in itself, and then help people to do that. But don't do that because you've got other agendas.
But states don't function this way.
Yeah, that's very naive.
I know it's a very naive thing to say, but it can be quite naive at times.
But I think they still have quite a
What do you
role.
want the United States to do?
Right. Would you like to answer the gentleman's question? What do you want, Omar? What do you want the United States to do?
I think more importantly is, again, to keep their hands on the shoulder of the military and the state security institution, which I feel it's much more dangerous. And the other thing is obviously economic assistance, civil society assistance again, and I'm sorry for that, including training and education. They train the military a lot. I went to Hawaii to give a talk on counterinsurgency, and I find half of the audience there are military intelligence from Egypt. So they are basically getting trained there. So they can do the same thing for civil society activists. And I had one more, but I forgot it now.
So we'll go to you, Maha.
The US has been involved. It wants to continue being involved. It's being forced to now back a democratic movement, or a movement towards democracy. For its own interests and for the interests of the people of the region, it's now on the right side of history, but it's got to now stay the course. And so it must stand up against human rights abuses and not back a military regime in any form. And try as much as possible not to dictate the outcome of free and fair elections. So therefore, if in free and fair elections the Muslim Brotherhood win 20% of the vote, they win 20% of the vote, and to respect the results of free and fair elections.
Yeah, I agree with Maha. I think it's a complex combination of stay the course and step back at the same time.
And here, there's a microphone here with you, madam, yes.
Hi, I'd noticed that a lot of these countries are very young places. The majority of people seem to be 35 years of age or younger. They're the Facebook, Twitter generation. Do you think this is some kind of coming of age in a way? Because it seems that when you get to that kind of age, you start to want to have a voice. And they're all, most of them, been born in countries that haven't really changed, you know, i.e. Iran, Egypt. Is this a kind of coming of age psyche of this area? It seems to be they're the motivators of it.
I mean, people in the room will put me right, but I think half the population of Iran is under 25. There'll be people in the room who know better.
I think it's people are very young, and also there's a huge emphasis on education in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, and not a lot of opportunity. So you have this this thing coming together where you have a young population that's often highly educated and doesn't have the opportunities. I mean, from Gaza right through to Tehran. And I think when you have, I mean, it's been well written about, but when you have that coming together, it creates sort of a, you know, very powerful dynamic.
Well, most revolutions are by young men anyway, but so there's nothing new here. But the new thing,
there's been many women actually, taking part.
I'm really sorry. young women and men, and I think the changes in the means, mainly the means that most of these young men and women in Egypt now have, and other Arab places. But also we've seen, if you looked at this revolution, it's mostly upper middle class young men and women, and well educated, having these tools, and to a large degree they outmaneuvered a very repressive regime. Most of them were built under Mubarak period, and it's a trial and error being born in this and living in this society.
Can I say just one thing about resistance? Yes, we're seeing it manifest itself now in a way that can change things, but throughout the region different groups of men and women have resisted and have been imprisoned and have been tortured and have stood up for decades. It's just now it's all coalesced and been represented in a different way, but people have resisted these regimes for a very long time.
I think the younger population in Iran are actually children of the previous younger population of Iran that just revolted, and the memories are very fresh in their minds, and I think that's a large contributory factor to the fact that the revolution isn't happening in Iran.
Shall we stay on Iran? We've got 15 minutes left this evening, so thank you for raising that, but would you like to flesh that out? Which are you talking about, the children of 79?
Yeah, these are this generation, they are the children of the 79 generation.
Okay, well, would the panel like to address Iran, and anyone in the audience direct your comments on this question? The question we've all come into, what now for Egypt and its neighbours? What now for Iran, given this tide that's sweeping? Maha, would you begin, and we'll take all of your comments with 15 minutes to go, everyone.
I mean, Iran really experienced a true revolution in '79. I mean, that is the fascinating thing, that again it's going through another type of protest, which may amount to a counter-revolution of sorts because of the degree of authoritarian control. Iran, compared to other Arab countries, the regional countries, has had a parliamentary system of sorts, but under an Islamist umbrella. And there's no denying that. But the very fact that it disallowed very basic freedoms for an entire generation has meant that it's had to pay a very, very high price for being ultimately an Islamist dictatorship.
I mean, I was last in Iran for the legislative elections, not the presidential elections, and one of the things I was thinking about today when trying to make comparisons between Egypt and Iran is that there is a very, very well embedded narrative of democracy, freedom, rights that was actually introduced by the reformists, and which actually is a very, very good basis for moving forward. What for me seems to be necessary is that what happened in Tunisia, what's happened in Egypt is it's breaking that fear barrier. And for me, reading the tweets and blogs coming out of Iran today, where people were threatened with death if they came out to demonstrate, it seems that there is a more general sense of a population that's prepared to stand up to that fear barrier. And I don't want to jinx it by saying it will happen, but I feel a lot of courage in the last
Yeah,
couple
but
of
I
days
don't think
coming
it.
out of Iran.
Yeah, but I do too. But I think that there is a huge difference, and one of the huge differences is to do with the media, and that is probably because Egypt was largely in the Western sphere, and for whatever reason they didn't feel that they could keep this off Al Jazeera and the other television channels. And in Iran we are all banned at the moment, pretty much all of us, and we are totally reliant on pictures that people manage to put up on YouTube and so on. The repression is absolutely desperate. It is huge, and journalists are not able to report. Iranian journalists are not able to report, and I'm afraid I think that is a very critical factor at the moment.
Can I ask you in the audience to predict change or not in Iran brought from the street? If you within 2 years, do you think it's going to happen?
No.
Put your hand up. No one.
No one. Oh no, I'm going to be more optimistic. Put my hand up and say yes.
2,
Iran,
3.
Something will happen in Iran.
Okay, so 4 people think. Will it be brought from the street?
Yes.
Yes.
No, I think both from the street and from the state institutions.
I just want to say something about it. There is another difference in addition to what Lindsay mentioned. Egypt and Tunisia, the regimes there were basically the closest thing to a mafia state. The ones who were linked to them had basically material interests, period. No charisma, no ideology, no vision, no support on the street unless you are directly benefiting from them. Whereas in the Iranian case, they play on the ideological factor a lot. They have a figure that was kind of elected, Ahmadinejad, populist, quite perceived as anti-Western, standing up to America, so on and so forth. So he has some roots on the ground.
And
although that's not the majority, but he has some.
Yeah, but I think that is less important than the oil price and the gas price. Because the other point, can I just make this point about Iran? That the other main thing which goes on is that the oil price is very high and it's going up, and the gas price is very high, and therefore he has that. Now in Egypt and Tunisia, the economic situation was going down and worse, and they didn't have that lever.
Had an internal army. They have 500,000 soldiers to basically direct it against the population. The number of employees in the security service is 1.2 million persons. So it's a vast security system. But the thing is, those benefit directly from the regime. They get paid by the regime. But among them, is there really support? Is Mubarak for them a charismatic figure to follow?
Yeah.
No.
I kind of think sometimes about Ahmadinejad and his kind of messianic sort of Shia vision that's overstated. I mean, I went to his home village, and everyone told me if I went there, this would be the place where I would find people who would say what a great guy he was and how proud we were of him. And actually, when you finally got to talk to people in the back room of grocery shops and places like that, they said, he's a bit of a loser, really. He hasn't made life any better for us.
Yes.
And I kind of think that this notion that there is this kind of little bunch of people up in North Tehran and everyone else is quite conservative and supports them, it's not quite true.
I agree.
Because people look at how the price of tomatoes, as my colleague Robert Tate wrote a very good piece about. People suffer because of his rather sort of stupid economic policies, and that notion of him being terribly charismatic and supported is actually more fragile than people think.
Can I ask you, listen to you tonight, do you think that their focus of the enemy outside is stronger than the focus of the enemy outside? You were explaining to us how there was no burning of the American flag in Tahrir Square. Do you feel that because there's a very focused enemy outside for the Iranian philosophy, that's helping them keep a lid on?
Not anymore. Because when before the last elections, in the week before the last elections, when people were able to go out on the streets and say what they thought and what they felt, I didn't give up at all. People were carrying banners saying, "America, we are your friend," and I think it is just the elite and the powers that be that use that, and it works in some sectors, but I don't think it works for most Iranians, not anymore.
Okay, to you, and then with the panel, would you consider some closing thoughts, things you haven't said, things you didn't want to say that you want to correct? And in the room, if you haven't got what you came for, please mention it now, because we do run the meeting for your benefit and ours. So to you, and then to you.
I have a point about the media, and I just have a question also for maybe Peter and Lindsay, because they've been, I think, to Iran, and maybe they can comment on this. And it's about the leadership. The Iranian movement in 2009, they had Karoubi, Mousavi, Khatami as leaders, of the movement. But these three figures were kind of part of the establishment. In 1980s, Mousavi was the prime minister, Karoubi was the head of the Majlis, and Khatami, of course, he was the president. While in the Egyptian case, there wasn't really a figure that you could describe as the leader of the movement. That one point that I don't know if they want to comment on that, but on the issue of the media in Iran as well, I know, Lindsay, that you've been to Iran, but I think even when you were allowed to go there, most of the country, like the ethnic areas, like the Kurdish region, those regions are off and you can't basically go there. So when you say that people were having like some banner saying that we want America or something, that it's not really representative of the whole country. And that one of the problem that I had with 2009 and the way the Iranian case was covered, because was that there wasn't really that much coming from the periphery, from the provinces around the country, because you simply were not allowed to go there.
No, that's not
Will you
completely
take his second part?
Yeah, that's not completely true. I mean, I went to Isfahan. Scott Peterson from the Christian Science Monitor, who's written a great book called Let the Swords Encircle Me, went to all sorts of different places. People did not just go to Tehran. People went to other places. And journalists, were very surprised to find how much support there was for the opposition in those places. Of course, you're right that we were not completely free and we couldn't go everywhere, but it wasn't just Tehran, and we didn't just report from Tehran. Final point. I think that what happened in Iran was the people moved far ahead of Mousavi and Khatami and Karoubi. And although they are the titular heads of the opposition, I think that the young people on the streets were leading them, and they were running to catch up.
Okay, Peter, hold your tongue to your closing remarks. To you at the back, we'll give the last word to you. You've got the microphone.
Okay. I'm just interested in why you think these...
Using it, please.
Sorry, hear me now? These protests happened now rather than 6 months ago or 2 years ago. And what role, if any, you thought that rising food prices played in these, and what that means for countries across the Arab world, but other places in the world where food prices are going to spiral out of control?
Why now rather than 6 months ago, and what role food prices, which are still going up, would you all like to take this?
Okay, I think people like Malcolm Gladwell have tried to sort of suggest that the social media didn't have a big role to play. I think in Tunisia, where this started off, there was Facebook in particular, and in particular the way in which the Bouazizi immolation video was placed in a particular narrative, which wasn't necessarily completely true. I mean, he wasn't a university graduate. Actually played into a lot of very, very tender feelings. I think the same went for Egypt, and people realised that there was a possibility to communicate a message in a powerful way that went outside of the traditional ways people communicated before, and they harnessed it, and it went viral. I mean, it's like a viral tweet or a viral posting on YouTube. It went viral. It was about emotion as much as politics, and it just hit a moment.
I think it's part of it has to do with trial and error to a large degree. This is not the first time that Kullina Khalid Said, We're All Khalid Said Facebook group calls for demonstrations. Actually goes down. They went 2 times before this time, and they were in the hundreds. This time they were in the hundreds of thousands, and mainly I can give you a long list of tactics, from going to the poorer neighborhoods as opposed to the upper middle class ones where they started the last time. They knew how to circumvent and give like more or less tricky or divert the attention from the security services multiple times. So it was part of this is the activism tactics and the learning how to deal with security services. But the other part is, I guess, pure luck in this sense. They weren't the security services did not know who's running this and who are the activists before things started mushrooming, and then the response from the Egyptian people to a large degree. So it's there are missing variables, I agree, but to a large degree, this is what I can gather now.
Okay, and the question of why now?
In terms of Egypt?
I think in the region, your question is why is there a viral revolution now?
I think it's also what you see happening in one place. Having succeeded in Tunis, I mean, if I look at Egypt, I think having seen that people can come onto the street and effect change, that Ben Ali fled, that all adds to the momentum, as well as everything else that's been said. I think the issue of food prices, yes, rising food, that may still come. in the sense that we may see a different dimension where different types of people come onto the streets because of rising food prices, and then you may have some more mob-like protests and demonstrations, which was essentially what was feared would happen in Egypt and hasn't quite happened yet and may well happen.
Okay, can I ask you for your closing thoughts? Things that you wish you'd said and you didn't, and the one thing that we must take away from this evening, but not too long, and we'll end on time, starting with you.
We're talking about a tipping point and everything that leads into that. And that's from Facebook to food prices. It's all of those things. But the fact of the matter is that journalists are absolute rubbish at predicting things. None of us predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall. None of us, we all wrote in December our predictions for the year, and I've yet to meet anybody who predicted that the Arab world would be in flames and that Mubarak would be overthrown and the Tunisian regime would come down. We seem to have reached this tipping point for all these different reasons. Communication is a huge part of it because now the flames spread through all these different kind of media. But we would be mugs to say we know which regime is going to go next. We don't know which regime is going to go next, but we do know that something has changed forever.
I think something has changed forever. I think Egypt and various countries in the region will see free and fair elections, but I don't think that is tantamount to real change for the majority of people. I think it's change insofar that they will have checks and balances on power, that they will be able to speak out freely, and that is enormous, and that in itself is a revolution. But I think we still need to think of this change as one that may affect or be to the advantage mostly of middle-class elements in these societies. And I keep reminding myself that Egypt is made up much more than just its middle classes that have always been at the bottom of the heap, where we have to take advantage of this situation, Egyptians particularly, to speak out for the majority of people in Egypt in terms of a minimum wage, in terms of the interests of the vast majority of Egyptians. And what worries me is this can be a revolution in terms of regime change, yes, in terms of freedoms, yes, but maybe the whole issue of social justice will still remain on hold, and that is a very worrying thing.
Yes, first, don't feel bad, Lindsay. Political scientists and academics did not do a better job. They did not predict the end of the Cold War. I read a piece just before the Tunisian events in a prestigious academic journal saying that Tunisia is actually the model for economic development, and there you go. That's on one side. I think the critical issue now is how this transition period. We know that democracy goes through 4 phases. One of them is the removal of dictatorships, then transition, then maturation, then consolidation, then maturation. So now we're somewhere in between the removal of dictatorship, because the remnants of the regime in Egypt and Tunisia still exist, and then we need to move a bit further into the transition period. And the transition period, I think it will be quite critical, and therefore everybody has to be watchful. The pressures from the inside and from the outside, whether in Tunisia or in Egypt, has to be maintained. The pressures from the protesters, the pressures from the international community, including the US, has to be maintained to keep this on the right track and to finally have a 4th wave of democratization in North Africa and the Middle East.
It's kind of more of a warning than a prediction. Don't believe anything anyone tells you. I mean, I've read so many columns saying, is this 1979 in Iran? Is this 1989 in Europe? It's none of those things. No one can tell you what will happen. If you want to know what's happening, don't read kind of middle-class white blokes like me who live in Tottenham. Subscribe to the great Egyptian, Tunisian, Iranian blogs and Twitter feeds, and try and work out from people who are involved what's really happening, because the people on the ground know much more than we do.
Just a last note on media. This is Al-Ahram newspaper, the official regime newspaper, on the 3rd of February, basically saying that millions are out to support Mubarak, and having pictures of the Tahrir Square saying that those are Mubarak supporters. This is the 11th of February once he gone down, and it's saying basically that the people have toppled the Mubarak regime, and then saying, same editor-in-chief, nothing changed.
If I can thank all the panel, I think you've kept the best to last, all of you, in every way. In terms of what we wanted to learn, we're told to look for the missing in Egypt, all of us who are trying to follow the story. Where are the women? Are they going to be involved in taking any decision? Nice of you to come along, love, but we're not going to let you take any decisions. You know, that's an important thing to watch for. The US you raised, Israel you raised, Iran we tried to get to. But on behalf of all of us listening to you, you've given us 90 minutes of a lot of brain food. Thank you to Lindsay Hilsum, Dr. Omar Shur, Peter Beaumont and Dr. Maha Azam. Thank you very much.